Okay, well, thank you for joining us today. In this session, you'll be learning about the Strategic Workload Deployment Project that was completed at Canada's Workers' Compensation Board of British Columbia, also known as WorkSafe BC. This project was completed a move to Windows using the Micro Focus Enterprise tooling and was led by the longtime Micro Focus integration partner, Astadia. Today, you'll hear from Astadia's Solution Director, Craig Marble, and he will provide us an overview of the project, the challenges they faced, and what it took to complete the project. Also joining us is Astadia's Steve Stewart, Vice President of Modernization Solutions and Services. So without further delay, I'll turn this over to Craig and we'll get started. So Craig?
Thanks, Robert. Thanks everybody for joining today. As Robert indicated, we're going to be talking about WorkSafe BC and a project that we did for them along with Micro Focus to redistribute their workload from the mainframe to the Windows platform. All right, so a quick overview of the agenda. I'm going to cover a few things about Astadia so you get a sense of who we are. Talk about WorkSafe BC so you can get a sense of who they are. Talk about their business challenge and their IT challenge, the technical landscape, before, and then the target environment, that is the after state. What we did for them, how we did it, the challenges that we faced during the project, and the outcome, and then we'll wrap up with a Q&A session. So a little bit about myself first. I've been with Astadia for about 5 years now. I am the Solution Director in our modernization practice line. And prior to that, I worked for Micro Focus for about 16 years. So mainframe modernization and legacy modernization is something that I'm very familiar with and have spent pretty much all of my career working on. At Astadia, we are a full services integration consulting organization. You can see these blue boxes represent all the different lines of business that we support. Everything from application development, including geospatial, portal development, to mobile development, web development. We do some business integration and data management, including big data consulting. We have a quality and security practice that helps you test your applications and helps you make sure your applications are secure. We have a support desk, help desk operation where folks will outsource all of their help desk operations to us. And then we have a digital marketing group that does everything from design to Salesforce.com integration and even brand development, things like that. Now you see in the right-hand corner, the modernization group is the group that I'm in, and we do things like a portfolio assessment, portfolio management, modernization, and workload optimization, which is really what we're talking about today. And we do most of this work with Micro Focus tools. We do have some homegrown tools that we use to assist us, but we generally prefer Micro Focus tools as our go-to solution for our modernization work. So the Astadia modernization solutions, our approach is really finding the right strategy for the customer. Everybody's different. There is no one-size-fits-all solution for everyone. So that could be something as simple as redesigning your development and deployment management in the process for your development. That could be things like offloading your development, helping you get that set up using the enterprise team developer solution from Micro Focus. Could be something like refacing and integrating the applications that you already have across disparate platforms. Could be re-architecting and fitting your processes to fit your new business needs. Perhaps rehosting applications and data to a more cost-effective platform, which is what we're going to talk about today. Could be rewriting, starting from scratch, if that's something that fits your needs for the future. And it could be replacing your existing portfolio with a package solution, which has seen a lot of popularity in the past, but I've seen a little less emphasis on that today because everybody's situation is different. And a lot of times the package solutions don't always cover everything that you need to do. So there's a lot of retro work that needs to be done to fill in those gaps. So sometimes it's easier just to reuse what you already have and repurpose it. As far as our credentials with Micro Focus goes, we have been a Micro Focus partner for more than 20 years. We have over 200 man-years of Micro Focus experience on staff, extensive experience implementing Micro Focus-based projects, whether that's migration or visual COBOL work or training, so multiple solutions within the Micro Focus area. Over 85 successful projects, Micro Focus-based projects that we've implemented, and we have quite a number of former Micro Focus employees on staff, including myself, as I mentioned, from project management, but we also have staff from Micro Focus development, from their solution engineering group, and from their technical support group. So we have a very close tie to Micro Focus in that regard. So I'm going to move on now to kind of get to the meat of today's presentation, and I want to start out by giving you a snapshot of WorkSafe BC. So who are they and what do they do? Well, WorkSafe BC is what's known as a Canadian Crown Corporation, and their mission is to enforce occupational health and safety regulations for the province of British Columbia. So in the event that somebody gets hurt on the job or gets sick, WorkSafe BC works with the affected parties, both the individual or folks who have suffered an injury, as well as the employers, to provide rehabilitation to get them back to work as soon as possible, to provide them compensation as needed while they are out, as well as the health care benefits required to get them back on their feet, and some other services. They cover about 2.2 roughly million workers and work with just about 218,000 employers throughout British Columbia. And they get about 1 million claims-related documents per year. That is net new documents, which represents about 16,000 new documents per day. Now, that could be documents in the traditional sense. It could also be just objects such as pictures and supporting information that they need to store, which kind of gets to one of the reasons why they had to come up with a new strategy. So the problem they were facing is that they have critical core business applications that they developed in the early 1990s, and they were mainframe-based applications, but they were proven and they worked well. They got the job done. They had very little problem with the functionality, very little issues in terms of bugs, so it worked really well for them. But over time, because of the changes in the way people are doing business and with new ways of documenting support for claims processing, they're getting a lot of blob storage data, for example, photos and videos, and all of this was being stored on the mainframe, and that is a lot of storage and a lot of processes that needed to be managed. And because of that limitation, they only had so much room on the mainframe that was practical in terms of the cost. So, they moved things off when they would need to make up more space. And so, for example, if you wanted to do an application upgrade rollout, you would have to make space to do the testing. And so there was a lot of coordination that had to go on to say, okay, we need this amount of space for this particular rollout, so we have to take this data and move it somewhere else. And just a lot of coordination and really precise coordination to make sure that different groups weren't stepping on their toes. So this was kind of an environment nightmare. It was really becoming impractical. And not only that, but of course, if anybody's been in British Columbia lately, you know that it is a booming environment. A lot of new folks coming in, a larger population, which means more businesses, and all of this meant an exponential growth for needs on the mainframe to provide processing capacity and data storage to service all of these new employees and new citizens and residents. So this existing mainframe infrastructure was becoming just too expensive and too cumbersome and really getting hard to manage. So they decided that a strategic direction forward would be to move towards more of a service-oriented infrastructure, such as software as a service and platform as a service and virtualization. But the trick was to move to this new environment without any interruption to their service, because if there was an interruption to service, people didn't get their checks, people didn't get their claims processed. And so it being a government, quasi-government agency, there's a lot of emphasis on efficiency and making sure that things went through reliably and on time. So it was very important that there was no interruption to the day-to-day servicing of their business. If we take a look at their before technical landscape, they had an IBM System Z with 3,666 MIPS capacity. They were running ZOS, DB2 was their database record, and their job scheduler was CA's ESP. And of course, they had a lot of ancillary mainframe software that went along with any mainframe environment. They hosted approximately 72 terabytes of data on the mainframe. About 4 to 5 of that in terabytes was what you would consider active data, meaning data that was updated, inquiries on a daily basis. The rest of that, about 68 terabytes of data, was historical information, archive, data warehousing, things like that. And then eventually, the life cycle of that data was after a period of time, it would go from mainframe to off-site storage. But it was important that certain data to meet regulations stayed available for a fairly lengthy period of time. So the data requirements just keep growing and growing and growing. They had, at the time we worked with them, 2 primary mainframe applications. One of them was a claims processing application, and then they had some batch PeopleSoft support applications. But altogether, we're talking about 57,000 plus database tables, about 51,600 views, 120,000 different database aliases, 377 temp tables, 61 nicknames, and about 270 COBOL stored procedures, along with 752 flat files. So that pretty much made up their database environment and their mainframe environment. So as I mentioned, we had 2 primary batch applications that we were working with together. It wasn't huge. It was about 1,500 COBOL programs and their associated subroutines, about 869 copybooks, a significant number of includes, numbering over 8,000, about 1,500 JCL members. And they had daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, and year-end cycles like most mainframe shops. But of course, their cycles were, again, very important because it meant, check runs, claims runs, things like that. And then they had a couple of package solutions. One was PeopleSoft, and the other was a Kurum solution, which is specific to their line of business. And I believe IBM now owns that package solution. The trick was that the Kurum solution has a distributed sibling, which we did not play an active role in moving that application because there was an existing application on the distributed platform. But the data layout for those 2 applications, even though they were the same package, were some significant differences, especially in what we call the Kurum keys. So there had to be some transformation that happened in that process, and we'll get into that a little bit later. And then they had 58 what they called online applications. Now, when I think of online, I think of real-time CICS kind of transactions. Their online applications were Power Builder and Visual Basic applications that essentially connected to their DB2 environment on the mainframe, and in some cases executed stored procedures, in other cases just put data out on the databases that the daily batch cycles would then massage and actually do the application work. So that was their online environment, and again, there was about 58 of those. And then they had an IBM WebSphere web portal solution for their off-premises and for citizen access to allow people to, check their claims, et cetera, remotely. So what they wanted to get to was a virtualized environment, and they did standardize on VMware for their virtual environment. Microsoft Windows Server was their operating system of choice because they were a Microsoft shop, not much in the way of Linux or Unix, so they decided to stick with Microsoft. And that is also not just the application environment, meaning their applications that we migrated were running under Windows, but also the database ran on the Windows environment as well. So we used the Micro Focus Enterprise Team Developer as our development environment to move the applications over, and then of course the Micro Focus Enterprise Server for the emulation and processing environment for the production, development, test in the new distributed environment. And they went from DB2 on the mainframe to DB2 for Linux, Unix, and Windows, or otherwise known as DB2 LUW, and again, that is running on the Windows environment. And then they decided to stick with the CA solution for the distributed environment, and that is Workload Automation DE, and that's really a logical choice given they already had significant investment in the CA tooling on the mainframe, made it much easier to move to the CA tooling on the distributed side. And then, of course, you have an existing relationship with the company itself, and it just makes things a lot easier. And then for their configuration environment, they standardized on Microsoft Team Foundation Server, which is a logical choice for this particular configuration. So what did we do for WorkSafe? So our role in this was really to migrate everything off of the mainframe. So that included taking their COBOL application components, all of those components, and migrating those to the Micro Focus environment, taking all of their DB2 data and migrating it to the DB2 LUW environment. And that included not just moving the data itself, but they did decide to move to an ASCII code set going forward, so it meant doing all the FCDIC to ASCII conversion, which isn't really that difficult. And then you see here this current key conversion, and that gets to the keys that are used in the mainframe environment look very different on the distributed environment. So that had to be handled as well. And then, of course, the DB2 COBOL stored procedures were migrated to the DB2 LUW environment, and all the flat file structures were left as is and migrated to the Micro Focus file system support that comes as part of the Microsoft Micro Focus package. And as I mentioned, the JCL was migrated to the Workload Automation DE. And then the WorkSafe BC resources modified their online applications to simply point to the new database, which was, a fairly, it was obviously a coordination effort and some programming effort, but luckily a lot of times it was simply the configuration issue of saying, okay, application X, instead of using this database, you want to point to this database. So that helped a lot. And then we supported 5 primary test cycles, and the unit testing was done by us, meaning our developers, after they make the changes and compile it, and they want to unit test the programs to make sure they're running in the Micro Focus environment. And then WorkSafe BC resources, with our help and guidance and support, did the integration testing, the systems testing, and then they have what they call stage, which is like a staging area before they move it into production. And that really made sense because they had a fairly significant testing team that knew their applications well, and it was much easier for them just to run a test cycle than it was for us to ramp up and familiarize ourselves with their testing processes and requirements. And then, of course, there was a verification process for the production cutover, which isn't a full test cycle, but it's just kind of warm and fuzzy, making sure everything is right before you actually cut the switch over to production. So if we talk about how we did it, the approach that we always take for these types of projects is a least change, least risk approach. In other words, you want to change the least amount that you have to get it running on the Windows environment, and there are a number of reasons for that, not just the least risk, but also it's a lower cost method of doing it and takes less time. So one of the first things we had to do was, of course, collect all of the application source components. That is all of the COBOL programs, all of the copybooks, the includes, the stored procedures, if there are any assembler programs, getting those, really everything that makes up that application online, the JCL numbers, the control cards, everything. And this is an iterative process. It always is, because no matter how good customers are at knowing their environment, you will find that they'll say, okay, this is everything that we have, and inevitably when we run it through our analysis tools, we used Enterprise Analyzer as well as some of our own tools, you inevitably find pieces that are missing. It's just the nature of the beast. That's the way it is. And in fact, we actually did this before we started the migration project as an exercise to develop an accurate timeline and pricing for the final project. There was an initial project to go through this process to make sure that we had everything and kind of map out what we thought the project was going to look like. That also includes collecting all of the database and file structures, so all the database DDLs, the view definitions, nicknames, aliases, and so on, all the flat files, including the seed files, the profiles, all the flat file structures, not necessarily the data itself at this point in time, but in order for us to do the testing, of course, we have to have data that we can test with. So it's important for us to be able to recreate as quickly as possible the target database and populate it with some data that will massage the application so we can verify that it will compile and run as expected. In parallel with this, we also interview key personnel from all of the affected IT groups and all the affected business units, and that includes people from development, people from testing, database and administrators, systems programmers and systems administrators, network administrators, the configuration management team, the network management folks, and the business line managers and the users. So everybody has to understand what is required and what effect a migration is going to have on everybody. So in order to be successful, not only do you need to understand what everybody requires, but you also need buy-in, because a lot of these groups have to sign off on the end product before they'll actually accept it and allow us to put it in production. So buy-off is an absolute necessity, and communication and what I call sort of an internal marketing needs to happen to make sure everybody understands what's going on. So after we did our initial analysis and we start the project itself, we have to take that completed source code, and we know that we have all the parts and pieces. We baseline that in a configuration management tool. Again, this time it was Team Foundation Server. And then we do another analysis just to make sure, double check that we do have all the code that we need and everything is complete. And then we run through some automated tools to identify the obvious issues, which of course is pretty obvious that it's database, right? So you're changing your file names, you're changing your database names and locations. So that is the big obvious thing that we look for. The other thing you have to look for are any ABCDIC to ASCII conversion related issues, such as sorting. That's a big one. Things sort differently in ABCDIC than they do in ASCII. So we look for things like that. And then we develop rules that we feed into our automated change tools because, again, every customer is a little bit different. So those rules will change project to project. And then we apply those changes to the code through an automated process. So we basically run through the code, turn a crank, and make those changes. We, of course, don't delete any code. We simply comment out the old code and insert new code with comments. And again, this is an iterative process, right? So we make the changes, we try to compile, and say a compile fails on 20% of the programs, and we take a look at that and see why it failed. We find those changes, we fix it in the automated tool, we run it through again until we get a clean compile. And then once we get a clean compile, we do testing. And if there's a problem with the testing, we find the issue. And if it's something that applies to multiple programs down the line, then of course we make a change to the automated change tool, to the rules there, and run through again. And the reason we always go back to that automated change tool is we will get a code refresh between the beginning of the project and the end of the project. So it's important that all of these changes that need to be made are made in the automated change tool and not just by hand at the code level, so that when we get code refreshes, we know that we're capturing all of those changes. The next thing we tackle is the database and files. Well, I shouldn't say next. A lot of this stuff is done in parallel. And again, the first thing we do is analyze the database and the file structures to look for obvious issues, things like the difference between data types on the mainframe and the associated data types in the target database platform, in this case DB2 LUW. So DB2 LUW will be a little bit different than SQL Server, which is a little different than Oracle. So there are nuances between all of the relational database systems that we need to take into account when we're moving from the mainframe. And other things like packed decimal and comp fields and how we're going to handle them in the new environment. We build a target database shell that will eventually become the template for the production database, and then we populate it with test data. Again, that's for unit testing, but then we'll move on to the other test cycles. So we did this in conjunction with WorkSafe, and you have to do that with any customer. The database admins especially to develop a data migration strategy. Because in WorkSafe we had, like anybody else, you'll have your what I would call normal test data, and then you have some specialized data, for example, the blob data, which behaves differently when you're migrating than what I would call normal data, like names and addresses. And then the current key conversion, which, as I mentioned, there is a difference between the current key on the mainframe platform and the current key on the distributed platform. So as a part of all this, what we ended up doing was we developed a really advanced high-speed data migration utility because we had a lot of data to migrate. And it's not just moving it from point A to point B. It's making the changes that are necessary so that it works correctly on the target platform. And we'd actually looked at the possibility of using some specific tools and hardware that are used for high-speed data transfer, but we were hoping that we wouldn't have to add an extra piece to the puzzle. So what we ended up with was a really sophisticated data migration tool that did a lot of in-memory conversion as it moved from one platform to the other. So we would take the data out of DB2 and in memory massage the data to do things like the current key conversion and the ASCII to ABCDIC conversion and all of the other conversions that needed to happen to go from whatever the data type was on the mainframe to, short or long int on the distributed platform. All that was done in memory to make it run as fast as possible. The first iteration of this tool, we would write everything out to disk, and then we would massage it and write it out again to another partition on the disk. And then we realized that, hey, if we did it all in memory in flight, man, it would just be a lot faster, and it really improved the performance quite a bit. And then we also took a multi-threaded approach. So different types of data moved faster than others. So rather than just setting up one pipe and moving everything through it as fast as we could, in order to speed things up, we did things like we took the blob data and we set up threads and said, okay, these data threads are just for the blob data. And you move it down table by table, row by row, and that's all it focused on. And then there was another thread that was set aside, or a series of threads for Current key conversion, another thread set aside for what I would call normal data. So we found that this really improved the performance as well as the accuracy of moving things down. And to make sure this all worked, we ran several data migration tests to validate not only the data accuracy of the migrated data, but also to make sure that it would fit, all of this migration would happen in the time window that we had to actually do the migration, because we wanted to do this over a 3-day weekend, so we had to make sure that all of this data could be migrated and converted and make it down to the target platform within that window. So in the end, we ended up moving the 5 terabytes of active production data and doing all of that conversion in just 7 hours using this tool into the new environment, and doing it with their existing network infrastructure. So we did not have to bring in any specialized hardware to accommodate this. So that was a pretty significant win for us. Then, of course, comes the testing. So once you get your database set up and you get some test data in there, then we have to go through and test the applications that are migrated. So again, we worked with WorkSafe BC and their testing group to understand their current testing process, agreed with them on the test strategy that we wanted to take, such as, which applications did we tackle first? Let's take the first ones and do some fairly easy ones to kind of shake out the kinks in the process itself, and then move to more and more sophisticated applications, and agreeing on what the success criteria was, like what is the acceptable criteria for saying, okay, we're happy that this application works as it does today on the mainframe. And we did this for unit test, integration, system, stage, and prod. And for the prod, it was simply a verification test, because we essentially tested the application 3 times before we went to production. So production, it was just a sniff test to make sure everything looked okay. We also obtain all the testing scripts and find the gaps. So even though they do a significant amount of testing, there are some parts of the application and some applications that hadn't changed in a very long time. So there was no need to do regular testing on those applications. So some test scripts had to be created to massage those applications and make sure that they were tested to their satisfaction. And then as a result of that, of course, we had to do some of that script development along with them. And then none of this would have worked if WorkSafe didn't know how to run and maintain the application after a migration, right? So it's important that once you get on this new platform that the customer is able to maintain it going forward. So we provided training on the micro-focused development tools, and not just the tools themselves, but also the new development process, because there's a whole different paradigm of development going from a mainframe development environment to a distributed development, a purely distributed development environment. So the process of promotion was different, things like that. And not just the development tools, but of course the micro-focused enterprise server, the execution environment, managing those environments going forward, because that tool is used for not just the production processing, but also is required for development and the test environments. And as you see, they have many test environments, so all of those test environments need to be maintained in order to make their development process efficient. So we need to instruct them and their systems programmers on how to maintain those environments and how to keep the Micro Focus Enterprise server environment healthy and happy, things like that. And then we did develop some custom utilities that they will be using going forward for things like FTPing files from one application to, let's say, a third party. So, for example, banks, when you're trying to do ETFs. The tool and the application of the mainframe would FTP it or set up a file that then gets transmitted to the bank. So we had to find out how the banks are expecting that from a distributed side, or if the bank is running a mainframe environment, making sure that what we send to them is reconverted back to FCDIC and sent to them in a format that they are expecting. And that includes also email notifications when things are completed on the batch cycle or when things fail, things like that. And then we did all the implementation and the production cutover on a 3-day weekend. This was not all that long ago, in September of 2014. It was a long weekend, a holiday weekend, and we were pretty much on site for the whole 72 hours, taking a few hours here and there to freshen up and get a couple hours sleep. And this was there was a lot of planning that went into this, because not only do you have to kind of get the regular weekend end of week work done on the mainframe, but then you have a series of tasks that have to happen in a specific order to set up the new environment. So, for example, we'd have to move, the first thing was moving all the data down. So that's all we did for 7 hours was move data. And in fact, it wasn't even a solid 7 hours, because what we would do is we'd move a certain amount of data, and then WorkSafe employees would verify that data. They had some validation scripts and processes that they would run to say, yep, this data is the way it should look, this data table is the way it should look. So that process was really consumed about the first, I would say, full day of the production cutover. And then it's, after all of that is verified, then it's running through the applications and doing testing on those applications to make sure everything is working as expected. And, we've had a lot of practice for the integration, the system, and the stage test cycles, so it goes much quicker, and also we don't go through the full cycles. And then, once that's done, the actual business unit owners, the owners of those lines of business had to bring in their folks to essentially hammer on the application and make sure that they were happy that everything was running as it should. And of course, we had to make sure that things were performing as well as they should. So this took all a 3-day weekend, and actually it went quite smoothly considering all of the moving parts. There was a integration plan that had more steps than I care to remember. So it was a combined effort. So some logistical information on how we did this. Our core migration team was in Jacksonville, Florida, and that is where we did all the source code migration. So we had an FTP, a secure FTP site. All the code was FTP'd to us. The database definitions, all of that was built out initially in Jacksonville. All of the unit testing was done in Jacksonville. And then all of the remaining test cycles and bug fixes were done from Jacksonville. Now, the testing itself, because at some point we are working with, it is masked data, but some of it, not all of it, was masked. So we did have, that testing had to be done in Vancouver, and we provided remote support. So, for example, a tester would say, oh, I found this problem, this isn't the result I'm expecting, and the developer in Jacksonville would take a look at the program and make a fix and run it through the promotion process. and then the tester would test it in Vancouver again. And then, of course, for the actual implementation, production implementation, we had a lot of people on call in Jacksonville, but we had a sizable team in Vancouver for that actual production cutover. And then throughout the project, we did have a small team on site in Vancouver. We tried to keep it as small as possible to keep the costs down. And really that team varied depending on what task was at hand. So if there was a problem with their environment that couldn't be resolved remotely, we would have a team in Vancouver who would look at that. The same for issue resolution. And then we had a team of regular, I would call them project management interface folks. So kind of a familiar face to interface between the technical folks in Jacksonville and the team at WorkSafe BC that we were working with. And then we did have one or two local resources, contract resources that we brought in. One of them was actually a contractor who had worked at WorkSafe before, so that was quite helpful on the database team to have somebody who kind of knew, had institutional knowledge of WorkSafe BC, and then another contract programmer who had microfocus experience. So that always helps, and again, it kind of helps keep the cost down. And then, of course, towards the end, we brought in microfocus professional services. They were there to help us with the training and help us resolve last-minute issues, and stayed behind after we left to kind of make sure that the microfocus environment stayed healthy until WorkSafe was comfortable maintaining it themselves. So if we take a look at the challenges for this project, I would say, and these of course are kind of biased and kind of in my opinion, but by far the biggest challenge that you face is just plain old skepticism, right? So you have mainframe programmers who have been doing their jobs the same way for years, a mainframe application, and the thought of moving it to a PC just doesn't compute, and it's just, a lot of it was, well, it can't be done, or they'll never be able to convert that, and so on. And when we started showing results, that is showing some of the migrated applications in the unit testing to show that it did work, the confidence began to build. But even up until the very end, I mean, even the production cutover weekend, I happened to hear some whispers in the hall that people were saying, you know, I just don't think this is going to work, and, you know, the newspapers are going to have a heyday when this falls on its face, and, you know, even up until the end, there were some people who just thought it would not fly. But we knew better because, you know, we had done it many times before. So throughout this process, you kind of have to have some patience and also reassure folks, programmers, et cetera, that may feel threatened that, you know, hey, I'm a mainframe programmer and we're moving it off to a new environment, and, you know, shoot, does that mean I'm not going to have a job when this is done? Well, the fact of the matter is that a programmer is more than just the programming language they know how to code in. So there are two things here. One is the application is still in COBOL, so their COBOL skills translate extremely well. Yes, it's a new development environment, and yes, there is a learning curve to get them familiar with that new environment, but the basic fundamentals of COBOL programming still apply. So that's important to get across to your folks. And not only that, but just their institutional knowledge of that particular organization, how that organization operates, what the lines of business are, how those businesses run, and knowledge about that particular business, whether it's insurance or whatever that business is. That's important stuff. So it's more than just knowing how to code. It's all the bits and pieces around that. So that's part of what I call the internal marketing program is, you know, you need these people in order to make this a success, and you need their help, and you can't do it in a vacuum. So as part of the internal marketing program, you have to make them understand that, your job isn't going away just because of this. You are a valuable asset to the company, and your knowledge is more than just a mainframe developer. So that was important. The other big challenge was the Kurum keys. So the Kurum keys are very complex and very different from the mainframe to distributed. And this kind of ties into the skepticism piece. There was a lot of concern that we would actually be able to take a row of data from the Kurum key tables and convert that to a distributed key that the distributed package will be able to work with. And it did take a lot of development effort and a lot of testing, but we did finally achieve that. In fact, I don't think there's anybody else there who has a solution for that. So it did require a lot of custom development, and that conversion had to coincide with the data migration. So that was a challenge, but we faced it head on and we overcame it. The other challenge here was the database administration. So WorkSafe BC has a tremendous skill set, highly skilled resources in mainframe DB2, not DB2 for LUW. So there was a bit of a learning curve there, and so the way we challenged that or took that on was WorkSafe BC brought on a DB2 LUW consultant to help train their folks, and then we actually did a lot of hands-on mentoring, training and mentoring with them to prepare them for the production support. So as the project progressed, we would assign bits and pieces of the database work to the WorkSafe BC folks. So they would kind of get their feet wet and their hands dirty a little bit at a time, so that by the time they had to support it in the production environment, they felt confident that they could support it in the distributed environment as well as they could in the mainframe environment. One piece that's not on here, but there are a lot of moving parts in a migration like this. So as I mentioned, you've got the development team, the actual developers and the people who manage the development environments. You've got the testing folks. You've got the database folks. You've got some business rules folks. And so all of these different tasks require different skill sets. So what we did was we broke these things up into what we called work streams. So we had a team that was focused on the JCL conversion, and we had a team that was focused on the database migration, and we had a team that was focused on Active Directory and converting RACF to Active Directory. We had a team that was focused on just the testing. And what we did was we would appoint a team lead, a stream lead, for each of these streams from each organization. So, for example, I was stream lead for the Active Directory, the RACF to Active Directory data migration, the data migration, and the COBOL program migration. And I had a counterpart, and in my case, it happened to be 3 different people at WorkSafe, who was the stream lead for the WorkSafe folks that were working on that. And this counterpart and I would work hand in hand, and I would coordinate with them, and they would coordinate with their folks, and then I would coordinate with my folks, and then we would report together at the weekly status meeting. And the key was that when we gave our report, if we were out of sync, then we knew something was wrong. But if we were in sync and we agreed with each other, then we knew that everything was good. So that helped a lot in keeping things going. And I find that the migration itself is fairly easy from a technical perspective. It's the testing and the acceptance criteria that was the hard part. So when you think of a migration like this, you a lot of times think of, oh gosh, it's the technology and it's a technological exercise. Well, really, it is a technological exercise, an exercise to move from one technology set to another, but it is also a testing exercise. And that is really the key part, because the customer and the business units and the end users will not accept it unless they feel comfortable that it has been tested. Now, it doesn't mean you have to test every single line of code. You're not implementing a whole new system. There are, it's an 80-20 rule, right? 20% of the code requires most of the testing, because there are only certain pieces that you are changing. That is database access and then certain other things like sorting, et cetera, and external interfaces. So you have to convince them that, hey, you don't need to test every single business rule that's in this application. You need to identify the areas that are changing and then test those changes. So that sort of planning and testing process is really as big, if not bigger, than the actual process of migrating the code itself. So those are the main project challenges that we face. So what was the outcome of all this? So we went live in September of 2014, I believe it was the weekend of the 21st, and everybody held their breath for the next month as they went through weekly processing, month-end processing, and then again at quarterly and year-end. But the end result was that WorkSafe BC was able to decommission their mainframe. I mean, they basically unplugged it and shipped it off. And that gave them an immediate cost savings of $2 million, which is significant. Not only that, we saw a significant improvement in the batch performance. So they had a pretty tight batch window. If something went wrong on the mainframe, it was, all hands on deck, because they had a very tight window they had to get their processing done, especially on the special cycles such as year-end and month-end and quarterly. So things that were taking, half the night were running in hours on the distributed side. So that was really good to see. They have a reduced IT footprint and a simplified IT environment, because now everything is distributed. So they have, a choice of any hardware vendor, pretty much any software vendor, because, Micro Focus Server runs on Unix and Linux. So let's say someday they say, you know what, we want to get rid of Windows and we want to move to Linux. Well, okay, Micro Focus runs on Linux. So they have a lot more flexibility. And they've aligned their IT infrastructure with their strategic business direction. And what I mean by that is, so now that they've done this, now they can look at things like moving this application into the cloud and really, really making it, software as a service and a real virtualized environment. Also, the tools that you use to migrate, the enterprise team developer has a subset of tools built into it that come along with it, no extra charge, that allows you to take business processes that are in legacy code, let's say initializing a claim. And you can take that business process and expose it to other applications without making changes to the legacy code, right? So now they can share functionality very easily with other applications. And of course, now that their database is on a distributed environment, they can use all kinds of tools to slice and dice and take a look at that data in just limitless ways. So it enhanced their integration ability as well. So it was a real success all the way around. So here is a quote that is from Mike Larson, their Director of Technology Services, and he really was the WorkSafe BC executive sponsor for this project. And you can see there that he's very pleased with it, that he feels the technology allowed him to move to a more flexible and lower cost platform in a virtualized environment and supports their business direction, and that is the software as a service and the service-oriented infrastructure. and they're very happy with the flexibility of their new infrastructure and modernizing the applications in the future. So that's nice to hear. And then one of the system architects that we worked very closely with and was actually initially a naysayer, so somebody who had a fair amount of skepticism that this was actually feasible, updated a website and said that they just completed this large decommissioning project to move all their DB2 databases to Windows and move the COBOL and JCL to Microfocus and the RACF to Active Directory and the scheduler. And the last line there, I think, is just great. It says, everything runs faster. You probably should have made this move years ago. So it's nice to see somebody who was initially skeptic come around and say, wow, this was great. So, and with that, I will open it up to any questions that listeners may have. So, Robert, I'll let you mediate that.
All right, great. Anybody have any questions? Let's see. I've put everybody on mute here. I'll go ahead and take everybody off mute. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask.
Hi, I have a question.
Okay.
You did mention the performance component with the batch windows, but I'm curious as to the performance of the online portion of the system.
Okay, so as I mentioned, their online applications were built in Power Builder and Visual Basic, so there's really no change there, simply because they were already running in a distributed environment. So the only COBOL applications they had were batch. Now, their access to the database environment did improve because we were running DB2 on a distributed environment, and that was, in fact, one of the things we focused on after we knew that we had the data migration piece licked, was then tuning the database before we went to production. So there was an improvement there as well, but I can tell you just from my experience with Microfocus tools that if there are CICS or IMS online transactions, that performance enhancement also applies to those types of transactions. It's not just the batch environment. So if you have CICS or IMS, that will translate as well.
Hey, Craig, this is Steve. I'll add something to that. The QRM application, when they ran it from the mainframe down to the Windows, ran a little bit faster. And the onlines that were triggering COBOL applications, there was minimal impact. As a matter of fact, the end users didn't know that they were no longer accessing the mainframe. So it was equal to or better.
Right, and that of course is one of the goals. Is you want your end users to, if they notice something, you want them to notice that things are running faster and better. So they don't know that they're not on the mainframe anymore.
Hey, Craig, I have a question that was submitted via chat. What was the overall role of the WorkSafe team? How heavily were they involved in the project?
So we, a lot of customers say, you know what, I don't want to have anything to do with this. I want you to come in and do it and just leave it with us. And that sounds great, but in reality, it's really not possible, because the one aspect of it is when you deliver something like that, your folks have to know how to maintain it going forward. And so if you just hand them the keys and walk away, you're setting them up for failure. Also, in this particular case, there was involvement in that their testers knew the applications much better than we did. Now, we were willing and able to take on that testing, but we decided fairly early on in the project that having their testers do the testing through combined management from Astadia and WorkSafe made the most sense. Now, we did all of the code changes, and we did all of the database migration and building out the new database. All of that was done by us with support from their folks when we said, hey, you know, we're having an issue with this program. We really need to get some background information from a SME on how this application works on the mainframe today. So there was some SME involvement in cases like that. But the actual work of doing the code changes and setting up the environments and all that stuff was all Astadia folks. Now, we did involve the network folks to set up the virtualized environments. Now, we would load the software on, but, you know, they have certain standard environments that they needed to set up for us to run the production and development and the stage and the integration, et cetera. So there's some involvement there on the network side of the house. And then, again, on the database side, there are database administrators. There were certain, you know, certain standards that they wanted to see transfer over to the distributed side. So that was really more of a consulting role for them. But, you know, we find that the more participation they have and the more information that they have, the happier everyone is, because everybody just kind of has their finger on the pulse of the project, and there aren't as many questions and fear, uncertainty, and doubt about what's going on. But, you know, having said that, if the customer says, I don't have any time for my folks to work on this, then we do the best we can with the folks that we have. It might take a little longer, but we can do it that way.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't have any other questions in the chat session. Does anybody else have any questions they'd like to ask? Okay, well, I think then we're right at the time limit there that we had planned on for this session, so I think we can go ahead and wrap it up. Craig, Steve, thank you very much for your time today, and it's always great hearing from you guys about projects that you've completed, and we look forward to hearing more from you in the future. Thanks, everybody, for attending, and have a good afternoon.
All right. Thanks, everyone.